we saw those revelatory statistics,
Wonderful.
extraordinary statistics, which had at their root an extraordinarily important observation for many people who think that population is the growth is the problem because of many more children being born. And that seems to me as common ground. We can lay that issue, and it ought to be more generally laid to rest. However, you look at the challenge of global population growth. You look at the statistics that Lord Patton referred to about the massive increase in use of resources and consumption. You see the financial economic crisis, the fears of global meltdown, at least in the short term. You know about climate change. How do you, having explored these issues for so long, not either put your head in the sand or succumb to pessimism?
I think it's putting your head in the sand which has produced the financial crisis. And therefore, that is not the solution that you have to do. If you have a financial crisis, it's because of absolutely terrible economic policy that I believe Europe has been following. We don't have to go into that yet, but this is a completely unnecessary crisis generated by unclear economic thinking. What is necessary for us, actually, and indeed, Hans Rosling's presentation was absolutely great in that, is pointing out how the causal connections are important things to do, and that includes economic connections as well as the technological connections involved, and he was emphasizing how, I mean, he didn't distinguish so much between income and education, because they altogether the impact of women's education in particular. When we compared Indian districts, for example, the fertility differences, about 80 to 90%, could be explained by two factors: women's education and women's gainful employment, which give voice to young women. And there's no other group which has so much interest in having lower fertility rates rather than constant bearing or rearing of children. So that if you compare income, that has not much of an impact. But if you compare education, especially of women, and women's economic opportunities, increasing the voice of women, you find a radical change. So you have to look at the causal factors rather than throwing up one's hand. I know you're not recommending it, you're trying to get me on to that. But
I just think some people are tempted to, because they look back. I mean, they look back to Brundtland in 1989, Lord Patton touched on that, and they saw the arguments being made. And then they look today, and the economic growth has continued until very recently at a virtually exponential rate. The environmental depletion has continued at an increasing rate. And they may say to themselves, well, perhaps I'd better just live today knowing that I will die tomorrow, even if I get to 60, like some of us have.
We can't change the fact that we will die tomorrow. But I think from the point of view of the social planning about the world to come, I think that would be the wrong attitude to take. All those things, including the point that the Chancellor made, absolutely, we have to take all this into account. I think what we have to look at are two issues. One is the technological barrier, dealing with resource depletion, generation of resources. We are dealing at the moment with one quite explored but rather flawed way of filling up the gap through nuclear energy. And that doesn't have the global warming impact. And the other, of course, is the solar thing. And if you think about that, I think the nuclear energy, especially since the Fukushima disaster happening in scientifically the most advanced country in the world, and also having and the most disciplined people in the world, producing a really near disaster for the whole population. That kind of situation requires one to think about that and find ways and means of developing alternative energy.
Let me come back to that in a second. I should say that after we've talked for about 10, 12 minutes, it will be your opportunity to ask Amartya any questions, comments, either on what we're directly talking about or related topics. But just before we come to that more detail, in this audience here, as we heard, you've got academics, you've got people from NGOs, you've also got a very large number of individuals who manage or own assets in the billions and the trillions. They have their responsibilities to the bottom line, they have their responsibilities to make a profit, they have a responsibility to their shareholders. Traditionally, people in those roles are obliged to think about tomorrow and the next day, and not about, as we were seeing then, 20, 30, 40 years on. What do you say to them about the potential to think long term, and I'm not saying that you individuals, because you wouldn't be here otherwise, don't think long term, forgive me, to think long term rather than short term?
Well, I don't think we are going to second guess the financial leaders about how to think about long term in finance as opposed to short term. I know that there are terrible mistakes made, and I believe that the rating agencies often give us terrible guidelines. On the other hand, I think the main thing to look at is how the financial incentives can be changed in the direction in which we would like them to be changed. Okay. I mean, one of the things is that if, for example, one of the reasons why solar power is so underdeveloped is that there is very little money to be made on that. Now, if you take into account the externalities, it doesn't have the danger of the nuclear things, it doesn't have the choking effect on global warming and other things, ozone layer and so forth. The way to make the financial sector to respond to it is not moral exhortation, but to increase the incentives. Now, if the externalities are translated into subsidies and taxes on the alternative, hugely under-taxed fossil fuels and hugely under-subsidized opportunities of solar power, what you're looking at is a situation which you can't deal with it by a moral lecture to the financial leaders. I don't think financial leaders are likely to respond to it, even though they will listen sympathetically. And as you said, you began by saying they have responsibility too, to their shareholders and so on. So I think what I find particularly bad, and we won't come back to the European financial crisis, it tends to get me off in a state of some anger. But if you look at the situation about the environment, I think the whole idea that you're asking people to be responsible, but at the same time not giving any kind of incentive to go in that direction, there's a real kind of schizophrenia in that, and that we have to change. So you see, the technological barriers can be dealt with by technological research. Technological research will be undertaken when there is money to be made in it. Money can be made in it by having taxes and subsidies in a way, not a new thought. People are reviving, rightly in the present European context, ideas of Keynes, but one of Keynes's contemporaries, namely Arthur Pigou, was talking about taxes and subsidies in the 1920s. And these are the things, and he was talking, by the way, also the environmental depletion as well.
But you say environmental depletion, and then we discover that there is a new form of fossil coal fuel available because of fracking. The United States is developing this very rapidly for gas and energy. So in the economics of this, that is going to be, because of technology, is going to be cheap. At the moment, solar, for instance, whether you can harness the Sahara, as Sir David King's often talked about, to produce enough energy to fuel Europe, is very expensive. Are you talking about massive taxation and regulation to divert the private sector from fracking in the United States, as it were, to solar energy in the Sahara and elsewhere?
Yes, that is exactly what we're talking about. The fracking is, at the moment, fracking, I mean, coal used to be the cheapest fuel. Now, thanks to fracking, shale may be coming to occupy that position. On the other hand, its environmental impact in the neighborhood is enormously large. Not fully studied, there's a lot of uncertainty left in that. Now, if it turns out that the environmental dangers are really so great, yes, I'm saying that you have to tax it to that extent. And similarly, the figures that you're quoting about solar is a time when the entire price structure is such, it takes no account at all of how much saving of the global atmosphere it's doing. It doesn't take into account how much nuclear kind of risk, and that just not only means an accident, as in the case of Fukushima, but also possible sabotage, possible theft, possible terrorist use. I mean, when you add these numbers up, you have a gigantic probability of real disaster.
It's interesting that you say this about nuclear, because we live 20 miles away, 30 miles away from a string of French nuclear power stations. And people don't say, I'm not going on holiday to France.
No.
See, they still just about buy holiday homes in France, despite the taxation promise or removed promise about increasing the tax on this. So we don't fear that, and we tend to think, and isn't there some justification for this, that in Russia, where you had Chernobyl, it was appalling nuclear power stations held together by string, and actually even in Japan, the much famed efficiency did not devolve into the cost cutting that created those nuclear power stations.
I think the Japanese efficiency in this is being vastly underestimated in order to fit a story that there was some negligence in that which produced it. And indeed, there was negligence. You know, I think I hope the French don't have an accident ever. On the other hand, if one of those things happened there, or you have a theft of a nuclear material, I also declare an interest as a trustee of the Nuclear Threat Initiative set up by Sam Nunn and Ted Turner. We tend to study quite a lot of that. The dangers of that is very great across the world. Now, we can make them more secure, but there is always a certain low probability of that. And when you think of the world dotted with nuclear plants, no matter how disciplined they might be, the chance and very low probability is the kind of thing that J.V. Holden talked about a century ago, that small probabilities added together produce quite a gigantic total. You're dealing with, everything here is of course concerned with evaluation of uncertainty, but that's the nature of the economic world. So what I would say, Jonathan, just to finish that if you take into account those dangers, the kind of taxes and subsidies that you need to make a dent on the energy picture is very large indeed. And if you're going to shy away from that and take to moral exaltation, I don't think that's going to solve the problem.
Okay, just to briefly summarize.
And I hope sometime we might get to the food issue.
Believe it or not, that's just where I'm going to get.
Okay, very good.
Via saying, just to summarize, it is, I don't want to put words in your mouth, it's an urgent priority to reduce carbon emissions and therefore the growth in carbon fuel. One priority. Energy, food, water, all linked. We have to achieve that. To do that, you need to inspire and give opportunities to the private sector by a combination of taxation and subsidies which will direct them and drive them towards investment in that kind of innovatory development. So that's energy, as it were. Related to that, come now to food. The 9-10 billion population that we're going to grow. There are huge inequities in access, there are huge problems of distribution. How do you tackle, and there are huge increases in demand for particular kinds of food. How do you say to the private sector here, it's easy to say it to yourself as an academic, it's easy to say it to those who believe that people, that their job is to demonstrate the problem. How do you say to people who say, I've got financial resources, I want to deploy them properly for the long term and make a profit? How do you say to them, tackle this problem of food?
Well, it's exactly the same thing applies, because the economic reasoning is quite clear. In the case of food, it takes a somewhat different form, since uncertainty of the kind in the nuclear or fracking is not a dominant factor here. But the picture is quite clear there. Despite all that, food availability per capita on a trend has been going up. The reason why there is a problem is because people are getting richer, having a higher income, exactly part of the story that Hans Rosling was talking about. And that is driving most of the increase in demand for food. And this will continue, not indefinitely, because when a certain level is reached, exactly what he was showing with his toilet paper thing, that it will not continue to go further up. But in the coming decades, we have a scenario where the food demand would continue definitely to go up. We also know that food prices, even though in the short run have been a rise, if you look at the long run thing, food prices have been a kind of dramatic trend of decline. Now, we also know that a rise in food prices immediately increases incentive to produce it and also carry out the innovations that are needed. Some of it done by public sector, the green revolution to a great extent was done that way. But even with subsidized research and unsubsidized research, having the incentive to innovate and produce more food is an effective way of doing it. The only problem that arises is that if you're raising food prices, you're increasing production. On the other hand, as long as there are big inequalities, you're cutting out a lot of people from being able to afford the food. So then you have to think about, if you really want to do it in a way that fits into all the priorities you were mentioning, how to raise food prices on one side, at the same time how to subsidize it in a way that the underdogs of society are not hit by it. So it's a combination. Again, that will require a combination of government intervention and market incentives. I think it's a huge mistake. I'm not accusing you of doing that, to take this as a kind of collision course. The market would respond to price incentives. The price incentives can be changed, taking into account, on one side, the externalities and the uncertainties connected with nuclear, connected with global warming. And there's a lot of uncertainty there too, by the way, because we don't know how catastrophic the result would be. I mean, all the calculations are probabilistic. And that on one side, and the other side, the issue of inequality and inequity. And that, again, is not the business of the market, as it were, to deal with it. It's the business of the society, of the public, of the politics and the public thinking on that subject. And it's a question of trying to combine them in a way that you provide appropriate incentives, taking into account the priorities of society, namely people not going hungry, people not facing undue risk of dying prematurely for one reason or another. And for that, you have to need both the sectors rather than put them in a collision course.
If you look overall at the challenge of food, water, energy, growth, the environment, are you, it's where I started off really, are you, in that, to use the old cliche, are you a sort of glass half empty man or a glass half full man?
I think, I don't, my eyesight isn't all that good yet, but I say yet because I have had an operation with a little plastic inserted in me, which has improved it a lot. But I think I'm able to see a glass that's half empty and half full. And I don't see, I don't see why I have to see only one and close my eye on the upper part and the lower part. No, it's half empty and half full. But I think what I took from Hans's wonderful presentation, and which is obviously I was thrilled at the thing because it's so close to my own thinking on that, is that we could make the glass much more full by thinking intelligently about it. And don't recommend the course of action of closing your eyes to the dangers. Open your eyes.
Thank you. We'll pause there, Amartya. I'm sure there are points and comments, questions that anyone is now very welcome to put. I'm going to start there, and then back there, and then here. So here, you first, ma'am. Could you wait until the microphone comes, which will come to you?
Actually, the microphone is going to come to you.
A microphone here, number 2, and then a microphone number 3, 2 rows back, just there, yes. Guy on the edge, just by you. But you first.
Yeah, 2, 3 wonderful presentations. Thank you very much. And all indicating the same concerns, clarifications, and the emphasis of doing things together with the market, and in your case, and in others too, to emphasize how a change of prices will change incentives and will allow the change that appears to be needed for the half full or half empty, actually half empty, not to lead to disaster.
Would you mind, you don't have to, of course, it's a free country, but would you mind saying who you are, as it were, and where you come from?
I'm sorry. Apologies. Graciela Cicilniski. I am a professor of mathematics and economics at Columbia University. And
a very distinguished economist, I ought to add.
Yeah, and I was lamenting the lack of women in the presentations. Yeah. But anyway.
So far,
yeah, but still.
That wasn't why I came to you first, because that would be gender discrimination.
Thank you. No, I looked at the whole list. And I'm also the CEO of a company called Global Thermostat. that is capturing carbon from air. But just wanted to finish that. Why isn't the carbon market, which is now in 4 continents, growing strong in the United States?
So which market?
The carbon
market, yeah.
Which is international law since 2005, which has the potency of what you are asking for to create change, which goes with the market and with the environment. It does what Lord Patton was asking, it does what you are saying. Why are we not talking about it? Why are we not linking with the global policy on climate, which is what we have been engaged so slowly, moving in geological time, but creating precisely the market incentives and the so-called taxes, if you wish, that are needed to make the transformation and change the GDP.
Why is it not happening, Professor?
I think
it is happening.
Yeah.
I'm saying, why are we not talking about it?
Why are we not talking about it?
No, I think, let me say 3 things quickly. First, that it's very important to talk about it, and I'm delighted you have started talking about it, and that will be followed up, I don't doubt. The second point is that the carbon market, in one way, requires some organizational supplementation. In the other way, you have to see it's rather special. The organizational supplementation is to make it really a market in the way other commodities are. And for that, you need a much more structured thinking about how this market would operate, how would be the clearing, running, etc. I'm very much in favor of that. And you know, you and I as economists may spend some time chatting about how to enhance what we have now. The third point, however, in the case of carbon, is special because the global warming, etc., had been linked in a certain way to a particular element, in this case carbon, which can be generically described as carbon, which could be produced which will be thought of as being produced, and we can think of a price of it, we can think of a penalty of it, etc. On the other hand, if you're dealing with such things as nuclear dangers, there is no commodity of that kind with which you can link. So there we have to be a bit more innovative in having those incentives by essentially connecting with our risk evaluation of nuclear technology and place it among the costs there. The main merit of doing it is, and in addition to what we can do directly by the subsidy on solar energy, is to change the incentive balance of the kind that we are looking at. What Jonathan was pointing out rightly, just looking at the market prices as they stand. The best form of energy is really so cheap that it doesn't give people the incentive to do it. So we have to change it. Carbon would be a simpler case. On the other hand, a lot more needs to be done there. But even the more complex cases being with the energy, including factoring in the energy of sabotage, terrorist activity, and so on, it will be applied to nuclear. So you're really pointing to an extraordinarily important area.
Thank you. And just there.
Amory Lovins, Rocky Mountain Institute. Many countries, including my own, have the curious habit of taxing jobs and income of which we want more, and subsidizing depletion and pollution of which we want less. Wouldn't it raise total factor productivity and make us all better off if we did it the other way around, or at least were neutral as between factor inputs? And if so, what's in the way other than those that get the subsidies wanting to keep getting them?
Well, I think, Amory, we can discuss, this is Professor Amory Lovins, we can discuss the exact structure of that. I don't think there's going to be a very easy, quick, turnkey solution of changing one into the other. I think these markets are quite complex, and even the point that Graciela Cicilniski was pointing out, that the carbon market's operation still has a lot of limitations. So I don't think we are going to get a turnkey shift which will make it all right. Now, you yourself have been very involved in the development of alternative energies, and you have shown that, in fact, even at existing costs, they are much more cost-effective than people tend to think. What we are saying is that could be made much sharper And your efforts much more fruitful for that reason.
Are you saying if you take the Loven's plan, as it were, and laid it out...
How do you see the Loven's plan?
Well, as he described, I know a little bit about it because I've heard him talk about it, but in general, that you can produce alternative energy which is as efficient, if not more efficient, at least for certain kinds of energy need, than conventional forms. Now, if that is the case, I know it's hypothetical, if that is the case, do you think it's possible for those kind of ideas actually to seep into the thinking of government, seep into the thinking of business? Because on the face of it, it's a no-brainer.
It would be a no-brainer if, and I'm sure that that's not everybody's claim, that you can produce energy at the scale at which we need it. And even if you go back to Hans's presentation, given the increased demand for energy, the bulbs, the washing machines, and the electronic gadgets, you need to produce an enormous amount of that. The fact that in a little pocket you can produce it very cheaply and very competitively doesn't mean you can meet the energy requirements of the world on that basis.
Quick come back on that. Would you accept that is obviously the case?
I'll get to talk a little about this tomorrow morning.
Yeah, just a phrase now.
But both efficiency and renewable supplies actually scale very much better than the traditional things because they're much more like computers and mobile phones than like building a cathedral. Of course, this is not at all what I asked about, which was balancing total factor productivity by subsidizing, if anything, what we want more of and taxing, if anything, what we want less of, not the other way around. The
turnkey. Let's leave that because I want to bring some more people in. Okay. There's a lot of time to return to this over the next couple of days. Down here.
Kajo Kochwese, Deutsche Bank. Amartya, we discussed this already way back at the World Bank, you might remember, but I would like to ask you how, in a very practical policy reform roadmap sense, you could link the path-breaking work you and others are doing on how we measure social well-being and progress other than by GDP at the macro sense, to the many sectoral issues that maybe are best reflected in the notion of vastly enhancing resource productivity, the way we measured progress in the past by labor productivity, in the future also very much by natural resource productivity, and then on this roadmap to design of the incentives we are discussing for that much more efficient use or carbon intensity. I, by the way, believe, and I would be interested in your view, that it's probably more unrealistic to get down rapidly from the 400 billion plus hydrocarbon subsidies, but intelligent designs of incentives like feed and tariff regimes for solar power on a very reliable scale with credibility, with longevity and transparency is probably the way to go. But how do you link these three? Which would need then, of course, an enormous effort of educating policymakers along that roadmap.
Just a small question there.
I think there are three distinct agencies you have to think about. There is the agency of the government and the public sector and political leaders thinking clearly on these issues. And there, all these questions about well-being, etc., are important. It's not that you ought to capture it in index. And in fact, when Joe Stiglitz and I and Jean-Paul Fitoussi and some others were asked by President Sarkozy to get a one index, we didn't. But we did feel that we could clear up the discussion about indicators much more fully so that people know what to expect of them. But I think what is really important is for the policymakers and the politics of a country being dominated by intelligent discussion on that subject. And just to get contrast, I mean, the financial crisis, no matter why it's caused, the whole idea that bankers and financial leaders could solve it without actually consulting people, and ultimately you hit the roadblock only when an election time comes, having taken a decision without any kind of consultation, produces a kind of dual world which is unsustainable, which is one of the things we are seeing. So I think what we have to go back is what Bagehot called the government by discussion, John Stuart Mill pursued so much, namely public discussion of all those welfare issues you're looking at, so that you're dealing with an illuminating, a literate, intelligent society. Then there's a question of a businessman may fully understand what's going on, and to some extent do charity. A lot of the institutions here depend on the charity coming from businessmen. But that's not going to be the way of solving the problem. There you have to change the incentive structure. And then there's the question of translating that understanding, that enlightenment, into things that, that become business friendly to do the right thing. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is to get the politics of it understood, so that every time you don't run into a kind of opposition which is really trying to hit all of it by either saying any intervention in market, it would be a huge mistake, or taking the view that the market economy is cause of all evil. And so you have to do a situation. I think a good clue for that is Adam Smith, and I just to quote one sentence in The Wealth of Nations, people don't seem to read it much, is to say, what is the purpose of a good economics? To produce a good economics such that people get their means enhanced such a way that they can lead a good, decent life, and also to enhance the ability of the state to do the public services, which will be essentially needed. So there is not, rather than putting it in a tension, you see them as a totality. So I'm delighted that you raised the question, continuing something we have discussed in the past, but I think Jonathan is wants us to move on. But just to conclude there is that it's that contrast, what the politics and public ought to think about, what the businessman should understand, but what should guide the business, bearing in mind the responsibilities of business in making money, in responsible for shareholders, and responsibility of everyone to explain and get the participation of the citizens as to what the hell is going on. I think that's the program that we're looking at.
I absolutely do not want to move on, but the clock is moving on because it has this tendency to do that kind of thing. I'm just going to take one more, though, before we have to stop.
My name is Charles Tang. I'm the chairman of the Brazil-China Chamber. I come from two countries where these no-brainers have been implemented in massive scales. We all know that Brazil has used ethanol, renewable energy, for the last 42 years. 95% of the fleet of automobiles in Brazil are flex fuel, where you can use ethanol or gasoline. And now they're, going to start fueling the airplanes with ethanol as well. China, as we all know, has developed alternative energy on such a massive scale that it has made solar power energy more affordable and wind power more affordable. I just came from visiting a village, which is a solar village called Haimin Solar Village, and everything is solar. So I do think that when alternative energy is not bogged down in politics, nationalism, boundaries, frontiers, we can do a lot for our sustainable future. I just, in the Rio Plus 20, I was there with the chairman of Ilion, which is transforming deserts into arable land. And as the representative of 3 state governments of Brazil, I have offered a Chinese petroleum company up to 1 million hectares of land to use for free to plant sugarcane and develop more ethanol to go further into green energy. So I do think that there's the no-brainers can be implemented without too much difficulty if one really has the will for it.
And just one thing to follow up on that, having smelt the deliciously clean air that you get in many Brazilian cities because there isn't fossil fuel, because there's ethanol, it's great relief. But that land that you're going to offer to the Chinese, is that land that would otherwise be used or not used for food production, or is it land that's specifically suitable for the use of energy rather than food?
Brazil has about 400 million hectares of unused land. 200
Yeah, but there's a great deal of
which-
pressure on it because, as we know, with the rainforest and the other arable
I'm
lands.
not talking about, excluding the rainforest and the Pantanal and the other environmentally protected areas. Brazil has 140 million hectares of unused land, 200 million hectares of land for cattle pasture, and it's only using 80 million hectares. China, for example, is using 140 million hectares, and it has no way to expand. There just isn't enough land.
Can I just respond to that?
Sorry?
Brazil is the only country, I think, where the triangle between water, food, energy, with the abundant resources is such that you don't have to do one at the expense of the other. Soybean, by the way, is much more in competition with the Amazon deforestation than sugarcane, where it's planted. But while, of course, ethanol from corn in the US absolutely makes no sense,
That's right.
in Brazil you can do all three, but still it requires even better policies than they have now.
I don't know where we got to with the question, but a very brief summary answer.
Well, I
if you
think
would.
the positive point that Charles was making is very well taken. So one has to be not as pessimistic as one may be tempted. Secondly, the distinctions have to be made about the resource availability in Brazil and elsewhere. Thirdly, we have to see how the ethanol is being produced. The United States, the use of corn or maize has really had quite a bad effect on food prices and food availability in the world. We have to look at. And then we have to look at the scale of the problem, come back to Hans's thing, that we have an energy need which won't be met just by the unutilized land in Brazil and China. We have to go beyond that. So we have to welcome the positive side of the story, but treat it as a way for going ahead without being pessimistic, but recognizing that the problem is much larger than that.
We're back to our glass half empty with one eye and half full with the other.
Yeah.
Amartya Sen, thank you very much. If it was a broadcast, I'd be in terrible trouble on off air because we're overrunning. Thank you so much.